and move on to the next section on the agenda, which is the Stormont House Agreement. Is homegrown austerity. It is the collective work of all of the 5 executive parties, and John Lowry, our General Secretary, is going to lead on this one.
Comrades, I just want to be very brief on this, but I want to highlight what I feel are a number of very pertinent issues. I think the issue of cuts has been very well documented, and there is much comment about the effects which cuts will have, and indeed many people who live in communities anyway or who work in industries which are particularly vulnerable or affected by these cuts will know from their day-to-day experience just exactly what it means. But just to very briefly say what it will mean, and then to go on to tackle what I think is the real issue, and that is to address the question of homegrown austerity. Because particularly in the past year, during the recent general election, I think the mainstream parties have been reasonably successful in attempting to put across the view that the cuts which we are suffering are all as a result of the Conservative government in London under David Cameron, and really there's not a great deal that the Executive or the Assembly in Northern Ireland can do about that. And indeed that they're doing their best, and they're involved in all these negotiations to try and ameliorate or to plead a special case for Northern Ireland, largely based on the fact that we've come out of 40 years of troubles, conflict, call it what you will. But I don't believe that that's the truth at all. The reality is that the Stormont House Agreement came to be dominated not by the issues of the past or flags and culture and identity, but it became a process about dealing with the Northern Ireland economy. And the section which deals with the whole document is only about 9 pages. It is 9 pages long. But the section which deals with the Northern Ireland economy is actually only 2 sides of an A4 page. But it is quite significant, and it does set out some very important parameters. Now, in case we're in any doubt, the Irish Congress identified the Stormont House Agreement as being a very negative process and something that was going to be detrimental to the Northern Ireland economy, detrimental to workers and their families in Northern Ireland. So much so that a day of action was organised last March, not against the cuts from Stormont, but against the cuts from Westminster, but against the Stormont House Agreement itself. And you will remember there was a huge turnout at centres all across Northern Ireland, including in Belfast. And at those demonstrations, and Brian Canfield, speaker on the day in Belfast, quite correctly identified 2 important issues in the Stormont House Agreement. And they were the question of corporation tax and a tax on the public sector. And Unison couldn't have been any clearer. I quote from a Unison document that says, "The current cuts arising out of the budget set under the Stormont House Agreement," no, set under the Stormont House Agreement, not from David Cameron, not from Westminster, set under the Stormont House Agreement, "will pile more misery on the working people as well as the unemployed and those who cannot work." And the Irish Congress of Trade Unions produced a small newspaper, 20,000 copies of it, entitled People's Voice, in which it featured experiences of frontline staff in the public services, which set out in great detail how these cuts would adversely impact upon health, education, the economy, social services, the arts, the community and voluntary sector. And it concluded by saying that we must challenge our public representatives to resist the cuts. The stupidity of borrowing 700 million to lay off up to 20,000 workers, and the gamble of giving businesses 400 million by slashing corporation tax on their profits. Now, the reality is that insofar as the Northern Ireland Executive and Local Assembly have an economic strategy, it is based on one sole thing, and that is cutting corporation tax. And for years, the local business community championed and lobbied the cause of slashing corporation tax, in the belief, they say, that by slashing corporation tax, that huge numbers of jobs would be created by all sorts of foreign direct investment, which would only be too willing to come and locate on Northern Ireland. It's based on a failed model anyway. It's based largely on looking over the border at the Irish Republic and saying that the low rate of corporation tax was responsible for creating the economic miracle which happened down south. But without getting into the detail, that argument has been demolished so many times over. And the 12.5% rate, which is the nominal rate of corporation tax in the south, the realities are, and there are a huge number of economic studies which show it, that in fact most companies pay closer to 5 or 6% corporation tax. They don't even pay the nominal 12.5%. So this became the central feature of the Stormont House Agreement. And as their masters in London told them, they did indeed adopt a budget in January 2015, which did what David Cameron told them to do, and that was to cut the public sector. Now, we have since had the impasse over welfare reform, which Sinn Féin created the illusion that they were standing up for welfare reform, for welfare recipients, and that they were going to resist this welfare reform. That Sinn Féin have not stopped Tory welfare reform. The best, and we have to give credit here to Stephen Agnew of the Green Party, who exposed this in the Northern Ireland Assembly. The best that Sinn Féin did was to secure a transitional fund whereby people who lost out in their weekly social welfare benefits could apply, and the key word is could apply, to this new fund to make up the shortfall. No guarantee that they would be getting it, but that they could apply. And for once, the spin masters and the backwards men and Sinn Féin, who are so very clever, got their sums wrong. And it was Stephen Agnew who pointed out that the money available in the pot would not make up anywhere near the shortfall that had been identified. And that's when Sinn Féin started to roll back. And in addition to that, they were coming under pressure from local communities in relation to this matter. But we shouldn't allow the issue of welfare reform to dominate the debate about the Stormont House Agreement, because the Stormont House Agreement is the document which sets out the economic strategy. And that strategy says that we must cut back on the public sector. And that's why the Belfast Harbour estate, Translate, all the other successful public companies have been lined up for privatisation, and that's going to happen. And the reason corporation tax has not as yet been implemented was that paragraph 8 of the Stormont House Agreement quite clearly states that in view of the progress made in the talks, legislation will be introduced as soon as Parliament returns to enable the devolution of corporation tax in April 2017. Progress of legislation will proceed in parallel with the implementation of key measures to deliver sustainable executive finances. In other words, you're not getting your cut in corporation tax until you start slashing all around you in public services in Northern Ireland. And that's the price that the local political parties in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin, the DUP, the Ulster Unionists, the Alliance Party and the SDLP all signed up to. So the reason why we have homegrown austerity is that the local parties did a deal over corporation tax, and the quid pro quo of getting a reduction in corporation tax is slashing public services in Northern Ireland. And that's why austerity is homegrown in Northern Ireland.
Comrade Stephen Wardock, I just want to localise the argument that John made as a bad deal for workers to the Craigavon area, where Craigavon Trades Council recently, Dougie Hart, their secretary, had been doing a bit of research and felt 700 million of borrowed money was 20,000 public sector workers. But what that meant was it was 8% of the total workforce in Northern Ireland. Craigavon has 11,500 residents working within the public sector, meaning 920 jobs in one small geographical area of not even 15 miles are going to be lost. the financial impact is calculated at 24 million per year on households, communities.
There's a bit of a sort of myth going around from the justifiers of the Stone House Agreement. Sinn Féin in defending the likes of the 20,000 job cuts to the civil service and to the rest of the public sector are justifying it by saying it's a voluntary redundancy scheme. It may be voluntary, and there's a queue of people lining up to get it, by the way, but they're not their jobs to give away. These are public sector jobs, these belong to the person. The other thing to remember as well is it's estimated for every one public sector job that goes, a third of a private sector job goes. So, David, you can add on another 300 jobs to your 920 figure there.
I think it's also important now to highlight the cases of single working parents who are getting crucified already. This is happening to them now at the moment. Their total wages are actually going to pay off the private landlord houses, which means on average they are working for £10 to £15 per week, and they're also losing their school uniform grants, entitled to no school dinners. So it's already happening in families now. It isn't what's coming in the future. This is actually happening to them now, and it's actually going to force more people, and especially single working parents, back onto the job. Thank you.